needs no introduction. We have City Manager of Worthington here, Matt Greeson. He's also on the executive board of MORPC, and he's going to talk about Central Ohio development. Thank you.
I'm glad that it didn't get out on the email too early that I was speaking. Otherwise, I might have a smaller group today, right? Put $1 in late for the work that the Community Service Committee's done on the outdoor education building called the Marolo Community Pavilion. I think it's awesome that Rotary's making such a big impact on the Worthington community with that project.
Matt, you can also put in another $1 because we just paid for part of the all children's playground. So you can put in $1 for that too.
I will do that. A City of Worthington Park, no less, right? Okay, I usually talk to you about business issues, business development, economic development, because about 70% of Worthington's city resources come from income tax revenues from our workers. But I want to talk about something a little bit different today. Our communities are made up, a lot of our resources come from businesses, but our communities are made up of neighborhoods. And Worthington and a lot of our suburbs are rooted in having a strong sense of community, having strong neighborhoods. And when you think about suburban communities, think about single-family housing. Who here lives in a condo? Okay, a couple of you. Anybody live in downtown Columbus? Okay, a couple. But who lives in a single-family house in a suburb? All right, almost everybody. And what I reflect on today and draw from some research that's been done about trends and demographic trends in Central Ohio and the change nature of housing demand in between now and 2040. And I am going to outright steal from other people's stuff. And there is a study produced by Dr. Arthur Nelson that specifically drills down on the Central Ohio Metropolitan Statistical Area that came out earlier this year. And almost all of the data is from that because it's the most recent, the most relevant, and the most specific about the region we care about. And I want to give credit to Terry Fogler, who's my colleague with the City of Dublin. As I was reflecting on what to talk about today, it's a presentation he gave at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, which I've largely drawn on here, that inspired me to talk a little bit about this. And if you know Terry, he's very insightful about development trends, and we should have him come and speak here for sure. So, a slide from Terry's presentation. Planners and local decision makers, we tend to extrapolate. And that's okay if the future's business as usual. But local governments or many governments and many leaders don't often deal well with what might be seismic or very large cyclical changes. If you look further into research about societal change, there's some literature that suggests that those big seismic shifts, particularly in big economic changes, big climate changes, big demographic shifts, happen about every fourth generation. Fourth turn, some of the literature called. That being said, one of the consequences of not looking at these big significant changes is that we make short-sighted decisions and we may make the wrong investments. So I don't have the answers to the questions I'm going to raise today, but I want to provide you with some data that is being talked about in the development and governmental planning circles right now and tell you that most of the suburban communities in Central Ohio are trying to figure out what we're going to do in the future. As I said, most of this is drawn from a study by Dr. Arthur Nelson that involved the Urban Land Institute, people like the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. He's from the University of Utah, and he's written a book called Reshaping Metropolitan America. He also spoke to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. So if you go on YouTube and you search for the Columbus Metropolitan Club, or go to their website, and they have the videos from their lunches. There is a video of his talk at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. This is directly from the research about the Central Ohio MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area, and I want to highlight a couple things that are important. One is that about 1/3 of the change in population between 2010 and 2040 is attributable to seniors. So let's touch on this. And when I talk about 1/3 of the change, what I'm talking about is change in population. So demographers look at cohorts, age groups, and we can look at data today from the U.S. Census and say there's certain numbers of people in each age cohort, but this study drills down on how each of those cohorts change over time. And the percentage of change in a cohort means something, because that's where economic demand is. And if you look at housing, which is what we're going to primarily talk about today, this is where those changes in those cohorts and who is changing the most is what drives housing demand. And it'll drive the changes in the face of Central Ohio. So seniors are the largest amount of change. The new majority, comprising all racial and ethnic minorities, will account for nearly all of the growth. So the new majority is the growth in ethnic populations, and I think I'll touch on that data in a little bit. But basically, divided into white, non-Hispanic, black, Asian, and other is how the demographers and the Census Bureau does it, is not replacing itself. And so a lot of the change is in what is now being called the new majority. There's also literature that calls it the browning of America. Well, that trend on a national scale is also prevalent in Central Ohio, and it affects demand for different types of housing. Down here, between 1990 and 2010, households in their peak housing demand years, so that's between 35 and 64, the people who have kids and have single-family households accounted for about 78% of the growth in housing demand. This projection, this looks from 2010 to 2030, and this is 2010 to 2040 down here. That same group will account for just 22% of the growth in housing demand in the future, single-family housing. So there's a marked shift in the amount that this group, that between 1990 and 2010 was 35 to 64, will demand between now and 2030 and now and 2040. The point of this slide is to show that when you look at percentage of population change in the state of Ohio, and it's something that I think we all intuitively know, but this data supports it, is that Central Ohio and the Columbus MSA drives the growth for Ohio. In fact, but for Central Ohio, Ohio would not be growing. So this looks at the share of the growth, so the change in growth. And if you look between 1990 and 2010, there's that 35 to 64 that we talked about earlier that drives the purchase of single-family houses. And this pie chart shows what I articulated earlier, which is 65 and older is 56% of the growth share between 2010 and 2030. Boomers, right. So a little bit about the net change in households. So if you look at at this between 1990 and 2010. So this is the same cohort, downsizing and peak space. Peak space means big single-family houses on suburban lots. Downsizing means over 66 and likely to buy something that's smaller and downsize. 79% of the growth in the change in growth. Between 2010 and 2030, 22%, 31% between if you add to go out to 2040. So you see basically an inversion of that data. This looks at households, a little bit of different measures. So this is households with children, households without children, and single-person households, and how that change affects this demographics. So between 2010 and 2030, households without children, that their share of the change that's occurring, huge, 87%. Households without children, 63% of the change being single-person households. Households with children, their share, 13%. So we're going to have a lot of either single-person households, and that's marrying later. That's folks whose spouses have passed away and they're living alone. There's all kinds of things that influence that, both in the baby boom generation and the millennial generation, which has kind of a different behavior in terms of their housing demand than, say, baby boomers or even my generation, Gen X. So this is population 65 and the percent of change. And I think really rather than look at this big slide, you just need to look at this. And this is the number of seniors 1970 and then the projection to 2040. So I think we all intuitively know that. I mean, we know this based on our communities, and we know this based on data we've seen at different places in time. But not often have we had specific studies about Central Ohio and a correlation of that data to housing demand. This is a different resource that's not Nelson, and it talks about the generational housing bubble. And I think you just have to look at look at where we are now, 1990, 2000, 2000 to 2010. You see that the dark color, which is ages 65 and over, is a smaller piece of the overall pie. And now, starting now, we're in 2014, this becomes larger, and by 2020 to 2030, you see that the large majority of that growth that's demanding housing is in that over the age of 65. So a little bit back to the issue of the new majority, or the statistical trends related to that. This looks at home ownership rates by different ethnicities, and you can see that ethnicity, home ownership rates are different by those ethnicities. So the demographers are trying to figure out how does this current home ownership rate now in our marketplace, and this is nationally, how does this project out over time? And if it does, what's the effect on whether there's going to be single-family ownership or ownership versus rentals? And I think one of the things that you're seeing is a boom in apartments and rentals in Central Ohio, and there's a variety of factors that are driving that. But at least one of those factors are projections that demand's going to just increase over time because of all the things we're talking about. Again, this is another slide that illustrates roughly the same thing, which is that there is an increase in population by minorities, and that we'll have a new majority made up of a number of different what are currently minority populations as you look out to 2030 into 2040. I'll spare you that slide and go to this one, which does a better job of it. So the preference by age of this, according to this study, and a look at demand. And so attached is red. So that's an attached home. You're connected to somebody else's home. Let's think patio home, think condo, small lot, and conventional, which means single-family home. Dr. Nelson's study suggests that the demand for that decreases by age, attached increases, and small lot increases.
And is that specific to Central Ohio, or is that nationally?
It's specific to Central Ohio because this is the data that he is analyzing. And he also, you start to look in this data, I backed up one slide, and you look at the share of the change that is driven by home ownership and share that is driven by rental, going back to somewhat the race and ethnicity slide, but also some of the previous data. And there is still demand he is projecting for single-family housing, but the single-family housing supply in 2040, we already have enough single-family housing, he suggests, to meet that demand. And so it is a smaller share because of the demographics than it has been in the past, and we arguably have an oversupply.
So would Arizona and Florida be already the opposite of what you're showing us?
I don't know. I think actually they face many of the same demographics in terms of the overbuild.
A lot of people from here going down there.
Right. Well, we have the challenges without migration. Florida, as an example, I can tell you, having worked in local government there for a long time, you measure in migration. And the health of your community is largely driven by, the economics of your community is largely driven by in-migration. So to the degree that they can continue to attract people from other states or other countries in order to maintain their in-migration rates, then they could have some success. But the demand for their type of housing that has traditionally fueled the growth of Florida could change because of the age cohort and the types of and the change in what people are demanding. I think the other piece with Florida is it's obviously economically cyclical. The community that I left is now marking the first year where their population is. They had traditionally been over about 500,000. They dipped under that. Now they're just now getting back to their pre-recession level of population. So there's an interesting, different dynamic going on here, there. Okay, I'll be quick.
No, that's right.
So this compares 2011 compared to 2030, supply versus demand. And Dr. Nelson is projecting that 2011 supply of the conventional household is here. That's largely what we're demanding. And you see a shift over time because the supply the demand is significantly less than the supply available. Michael?
Matt, how does northern communities, specifically Worthington, compare to Central Ohio and, for that matter, Ohio and national trend?
Yeah, so we haven't related this data down to the local level yet. I think it's kind of challenging to do, but you can look at all of the suburban communities in central Ohio, and the residential land use is predominantly single-family homes. And so I'm sharing this not because I have the answer, but because I think it's thought-provoking to think about if the population that drove 50 years of single-family housing demand, the greatest generation and the baby boomers, if that population is older, and they caused a seismic shift in home ownership and suburban development. If over the next couple of generations that demand, they change that demand, what are we as communities going to do about it?
But I think related to Michael's question, this thing along exactly the same lines. So if we offer a better education in Dublin or Worthington, then the trends that the University of Utah professor is outlining for the metropolitan area as a whole might be weaker here, because so more of the demand for single-family homes and a more traditional suburban type existence with education and so forth is will.
Let me get to that. All right. So let's look at some of this. So boomers are looking for something different. Is one of the things that Dr. Nelson talks about. They're seeking urban, close-in, suburban locations. So they want the experience living in a suburban community, the safety, the qualities that suburban communities have, that the urban amenities. There's a lot of, you had Jim Houck here a few years ago talking about walkable urban communities, and a lot of trend towards that. And this is a lot of what Worthington has been talking about, in Dublin and others. I think one of the good news things for Central Ohio and for all of our suburbs is that we're projected to grow significantly, 600,000 in that period. We got to recognize that it may not, our Rotary Club and the populations of our of our communities may look different and demand different types of housing as a result of that in that time frame.
Are you trying to say old now?
No, I'm saying more diverse. In this case, I'm saying more diverse. Obviously, the baby boomers drive that, and there's an effect on housing. So some of the takeaways, housing demand is going to be significantly different. And I think you touched on the fact that the conventional wisdom for all these years has been, if you have really good schools, number one, number two, good housing stock, in some order, nice amenities, recreation, a quality historic downtown, you have good location, you're going to perform better than others in selling single-family houses. The question is in the future, is that enough? And to what degree do we bend, or to what degree do we shift some of our development in order to meet some of this demand? And I think that is the critical question facing suburban communities. So what are we doing about it? Since 2005, Mr. I have that right, we have had in our comprehensive plan, for instance, that we want to seek to diversify our housing stock, to move towards this demand a little bit, to deal with the demand we already face, since we in Worthington have 20% of our population over the age of 65 already. In Dublin, amidst where we sit, they've been the most aggressive. They are rethinking the entire Bridge Street corridor from Sawmill all the way to the river, and they're virtually planning to build a city to some size, a significant amount of density, taking advantage of the riverfront. And I think it'd be interesting to have Terry here to talk about that. But if you look at this along the river, that's mostly multifamily and denser development. Gahanna has responded to it a few years ago, probably a little bit ahead of the market, with the Creekside development, which had some difficult timing. Upper Arlington has tried to do it on Lane Avenue, and they have developed more multifamily along Lane Avenue. There's another picture of that. And in Worthington, we are doing it with trying to create mixed-use, walkable urban development adjacent to the mall, not only to help the shops at Worthington Place by creating foot traffic, but to also help meet this new housing demand. And lately, we've been thinking about our future on the United Methodist Children's Home site, and how imagining in public how that might look in engaging the community in this conversation about whether or not we incorporate some of that housing demand in our own community.
Matt, you can respond to the demand of a variety of housing in a couple of ways. One is just to provide it, and the other is to make sure it's of quality.
Right.
Is that in the consideration?
Yeah, I think you start with the question of looking at some of the stuff and saying, to what degree do we want to respond as a community? How do we see ourselves recognizing some of this 10 and 20 years out? And if we desire to remain, which I think we do, a predominantly single-family suburban community, how much of this do we need in order to help facilitate new development and to meet the needs of our existing population, and how much of it do we need to be successful while still being at our heart a single-family community?
I'm not saying just how much. What kind of how much?
And then I think that's an important question too, which is if we're going to bend to this, what type, how, what quality, what characteristics, what amenities. And then the second question is, what do we need to do to make sure that our single family remains viable and invested in 20 years from now, not just now?
One more question, guys. We want to recognize.
Yeah, I just saw a study about a year ago out of Texas A&M University about market trends, and Generation X, Y, and Z are all gravitating toward multifamily housing. And significant, not a little bit, but significant. So it seems like the market has already shifted to try to accommodate that. Is that anything that we're going to see or plan for that future as far as?
I think if there was a vacant piece of land that we wanted to make multifamily or senior housing in Worthington, it would get built. And we have an insatiable desire by the development community to put that in Worthington. And to Jerry's point, in most cases we've said not there. And with Mr. Hunter's stewardship and others, we've tried to put it in what we think are the right places where we can attract the quality development and generate the type of activity that is benefit for the community. So I think that there's a demand for it. Is that bubble going to burst? I have no idea. If you look at this data, it suggests that there's a significant demand for quite a few years for housing on both ends of the barbell. I like to say we tend to be a barbell community. Big on both ends of the population spectrum, and on both ends you're seeing that demand, and we're going to have to figure out as communities how we react to it as a region.
Thank you for your presentation today, especially on such short notice.
Thank you.
And in recognition of that, our club is going to donate a book in your name at one of the schools that we do tutor.
Thank you. I appreciate it.